Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar from MEED and MEED Projects. This week, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the MENA projects from a data perspective and how it's affecting various markets and sectors. I'm Edward James. I'm the Director of Analysis and Content at MEED Projects, and I'll be running through this webinar and slide deck with you today. And I'll be taking your questions later on. Now, this presentation is being recorded, so if you're not catching everything that is presented today, you will have the opportunity to look at it in your own time. We will also be making available some of the data from this presentation available to you. We'll be contacting you in the next week or so with details for that and how to access it. Okay, so without further ado, let me proceed with this presentation. Okay, so there's a lot of data in this webinar, and I just wanted to outline the source of this data for you. MEED Projects, MEEDprojects.com is a projects tracking service covering all major projects in the MENA region, more than 15,000 active projects worth more than $7 trillion. And by tracking projects, we're able to quantify the trends, challenges, and opportunities in the projects market in the region. If you want to find out more about MEED Projects, for those of you who are not subscribing, you can visit MEEDprojects.com for more information. Okay, so what will we be going through and discussing today? So first of all, we'll be looking at COVID-19 briefly, its impact economically, globally and regionally, what it's done to the oil price and other major commodities. We'll then look at its specific impact on the projects market in the MENA region, how the governments have responded, and looking at the data for the first 4 months of the year and the impact of the pandemic on contract activity in the region. And we'll also be looking at April numbers, how they've been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and then looking also at different sectors as well to see how various sectors have performed in light of the virus. Then we're looking forward at some of the short-term opportunities, contracts expected to be awarded over the next few months, looking at some revised forecasts for the rest of the year, going through some mitigation strategies for companies in the project market, and then looking forward at the longer term pipeline for when this situation is over, what we can look forward to overall in the region. Finally, I'll be going through a couple of notable projects in the region just to give you an idea of some of the key and interesting opportunities available to you all over the next a few years ahead. Okay, so let's start by looking at the current situation with COVID-19 and how it's affecting the economy globally and regionally. As I mentioned earlier, we do have an opportunity later to have go through some questions and answers. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to enter any questions you might have as we go along, and I'll come along and attempt to answer them towards the end of this presentation. So what is happening worldwide in terms of COVID-19? Now, some of you might be familiar with this slide and data. This is taken from our executive briefing, which you can find on both MEED.com and MEEDprojects.com. This data is accurate as of the 4th of May, 2 days ago. And we can see that we've had more than 3.5 million cases globally of COVID-19, confirmed cases, that is, obviously, without testing everyone, the cases are likely to be far higher. And very sadly, we've had 227 deaths globally so far. 187 countries are affected, and this slide just gives you an idea of the breakdown of the cases, how many people have recovered and how many people are in treatment. Now, naturally, as we all know and have felt and seen, COVID-19 has impacted the world's economies. You can see here the world's top economies in terms of number of cases. You see that the US has unfortunately the most confirmed cases. It also now has the most deaths. But you can see how case fatalities differ from country to country. countries like United Kingdom, France, Italy have a much higher fatality ratio to other markets. We've also seen in this column here how governments are reacting in terms of the fiscal stimulus they're injecting into their economies. And having the largest economy, the US is also injecting the largest stimulus, nearly $5 trillion, to try and keep the economies afloat. We've also seen, of course, how this has impacted number of jobs. Jobs are down considerably from before the pandemic took place. We're seeing millions of jobs lost around the world, very sadly and unfortunately, which we can all hope will recover once the situation is over. How that situation has impacted key stock markets and commodities. We can see here, perhaps most importantly for the region, that crude oil has fallen dramatically over the last few weeks. On a normalized index basis, has fallen from 100 at the beginning of January to lower than 0 to almost -10 in mid-April. So we saw actually prices going to negative for the crude as storage dried up, and May futures had to be renewed, and so we saw prices for oil and crude drop below 0 for the very first time in history. Currently, we are sitting at between $20 and $30 a barrel for crude, depending on the type of crude, whether it's WTI or Brent. But nonetheless, clearly we are down, well down on the $60 a barrel we had before this crisis. We've also seen, of course, stock markets fall worldwide. There has been a recovery in the last few weeks. Nonetheless, there's a very significant economic disruption and destruction due to the virus. As we can see here, growth rate projections globally have fallen quite considerably. The IMF and other institutions have dropped their growth rate projections for the global economy and for individual countries down from low digit growth originally for 2022, now considerable negative growth. In fact, in some instances, more than in terms of as much as 2-digit negative growth. The only markets expected to show any growth at all this year are going to be China and India, of the major economies. And naturally, the COVID-19 has also impacted the MENA region. You can see here we have close to 88,000 cases in the MENA region. If we exclude Iran, if we include Iran, we have closer to 200,000 cases region-wide. The worst affected countries really are, I suppose, unproportionate to the sizes of their populations, but also a feature of the openness of their borders to international visits. We have Saudi Arabia with the most cases in GCC at 27,000, followed by Qatar at 15,500, and then UAE 14,000. We then have Iraq and some of the more populous northern African states down the rankings. So the region has been hit. May not necessarily on a per capita basis have been hit as hard as other countries around the world, which is something we can all be very fortunate for. Nonetheless, it is the case that we are seeing the economic impacts of this pandemic infecting the region. So that's the context for the next section of this webinar, which will be looking at the impact of this COVID-19 pandemic on the projects market in the MENA region. So how have governments reacted before we look at the data? So various economies, various countries and various governments have reacted in different ways, but all of them have reacted more or less by cutting back expenditure. If we look at Dubai, we've seen the Department of Finance telling government agencies it wanted to cut capital spending by 50% and to delay new projects. It also asked for reduced spending on ongoing construction projects. In Abu Dhabi, we saw ADNOC ask contractors and suppliers for cost savings, and we also saw the very well-publicized cancellation of up to $1.6 billion of contracts on its Dalma oil and gas project, which was a big blow for Petrofac, the main contractor on that. In Oman, the government has asked all state-run companies to cut expenditure by 10%. In Saudi Arabia, the finance minister a few days ago conducted an interview which had a negative impact on the stock market, where he very pragmatically said that the state was going to reduce budget government's expenditure sharply, and that Saudi finances needed more discipline, which was another way of saying that there were going to be cuts across the board to the government budget. In Iraq, which is very dependent on the oil price and oil sales, we've seen all public sector contracts have force majeure declared on them by the government, which of course has resulted in a lot of slowdown and a drop in project activity in the country. In Egypt, which has been going through a boom recently in the last few years, and is likely to be one of the less affected countries in terms of project market activity, we've seen the government announce a delay to the opening of both its new capital and the Grand Egyptian Museum, its iconic project, which are now being pushed back from this year to next. In Bahrain, departments and ministries have operating costs by 30%. In Algeria, the government has announced a 50% cut in the 2020 budget due to lower oil and gas revenues. And in Qatar, there's been no official announcements, but a recent bond prospectus launched by the government announced that declared in it that the government was planning to postpone $8.2 billion of unawarded capital projects. And then finally, in Jordan, we've seen the government say that it was going to cut back on its $14 billion budget for 2020. So more or less, with all these cutbacks and these reductions in expenditure, we are inevitably going to see some impact on the project market in the region. How much of an impact? It's not yet completely clear. It's fair to say that governments are still prioritizing their project programs. They're still evaluating the situation. It takes time to decide what to prioritize, what to go ahead with, and not what to go ahead with. It is also true that the governments are in the same situation as many of us are in. We just don't know what's going to happen next. We don't know how long the situation is going to last. We don't know what's going to happen to the oil price. And therefore, it is very difficult for not just us, but for the governments as well, to decide what happens. And while that is taking place, while decisions are being made and evaluated, it does unfortunately mean that there is a bit of a hiatus on a lot of spending and a bit of a vacuum in terms of project activity. What we do know and can see in terms of assumptions is that there is still some spending going on, as we'll see in the next few slides. Tenders are still being issued, awards are still being made on projects. There's been some very large notable ones which we'll go through soon. And it isn't a complete meltdown in the projects market. We can also assume from a historical perspective that governments are going to prioritize the sectors which they are most require investment in, social housing, power, water, social infrastructure such as healthcare and education. When it comes to prioritizing projects, one would assume that these would be close to the top of the list. And then from a private sector perspective, the concerns and priorities are quite different. While private sector entities and clients may already have the financing allocated for their projects, certainly they'll be evaluating whether the demand scenario for these projects is still the same and whether this will change. And of course, that in turn means that they may well have to delay or cancel the projects depending on this evaluation. So let's see now the impact for the first 4 months of the year on the projects market in the region. And just a reminder for those of you who've joined us a bit later, this webinar is being recorded and you will have the opportunity to view it in your own time if you're struggling to keep up with all the data, and we will make it available to you. Should also like to add that you have the opportunity to ask questions. Please ask any question you may have in the Q&A section below, and we will come round to answering them at the end of this presentation. So this slide here looks at the first 4 months impact of COVID-19 on the projects market in the region in terms of contract awards in the MENA region. So we can see here that in most countries there has been a decline year on year for the first 4 months in most projects markets. You can see here the UAE is down about $3 or $4 billion on the same first 4 months of 2019. Saudi Arabia down $1 billion or so on 2019. Qatar, Oman, and to some extent Jordan also down. We've also seen some markets slightly up in the first 4 months of the year, Kuwait and Egypt most notably. So we've got some mixed messages. Nonetheless, if we take the MENA region as a whole, we can see that there's been a 12% decline year on year for the first 4 months, January to April. So that doesn't at first look seem as catastrophic as some people might imagine due to the COVID-19 situation. So that is fairly promising. We've seen more than $35 billion of projects awarded in the first 4 months of 2020. So things are still continuing in many respects. But it's when we look at the April numbers, when the COVID-19 situation really affected, when we entered lockdown, that we do see more dramatic impact on project spending. So for the MENA region as a whole, we've seen a 43% year-on-year decline between April this year and April 2019. And indeed, it's one of the worst Aprils on record, with just over $5 billion of contracts awarded in the month. We've seen some countries affected more than others. We've seen a complete spending collapse in Oman, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar. Almost no contracts were awarded in those months, as they tend to be government dominated, and all government clients stopped awarding new deals. In Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, we've seen a fairly flat year-on-year contract awards in terms of work awarded. You can see that there's only a very slight fall year-on-year, and that's obviously promising for the outlook for the kingdom. And indeed, we saw even a small rise in the UAE to more than $2 billion year-on-year. Again, although the first 4 months were down, the UAE, actually in April, the numbers were fairly flat. However, one caveat to that figure, and that is there was an exceptional one-off $1.8 billion construction deal announced in April for Abu Dhabi for an ICT hub to a Malaysian contractor called Serba by an Abu Dhabi client called Block 7. The details of this project are still quite hazy, and it remains to be seen how that will progress. Nonetheless, it did lift up the value for UAE quite considerably. If it wasn't for that one-off exceptional contract, actually the UAE would have been equally disastrous and on a similar level to Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait in terms of project spending. We've also seen a more than 50% fall in Egypt to less than $1 billion, compared with more than $2.2 billion in 2019. So all in all, with some exceptions, we've seen a quite considerable fall in activity in April, and 43% down year on year for the MENA region as a whole. Now let's take that same data and look at it on a sector basis, and how each sector is performing likewise for the first 4 months of the year, and then on an April basis. So we can see that one of the worst affected sectors is construction. It's down 36% for the first 4 months of the year, and for April it was down 37%, a similar number. Now, it's true also to say that the construction sector has been in a slow decline anyway over the last 5 years, but this is accelerated in the first 4 months of the year, and I think it tends to reflect the uncertainty around demand for real estate. But it's also important to remember that construction is historically and is currently the largest sector in the region, so it is also perhaps the sector most likely to see a fall in spending. On a first 4 months of the year basis, we actually seen increases in spending in transport and power and gas. It's only when we look at April that we see spending falls across the board. Well, every sector has actually seen a decline year on year for April awards, unfortunately, led by construction, but we also can see very significant falls in transport. Okay, so now in terms of looking and analysing which sectors have been hardest hit and which ones have the highest risk of being delayed or cancelled. So we did on MEED projects, we did analysis of projects which in the last few weeks since the 1st of March have been delayed, cancelled or suspended, and we aggregated this number on this slide here. So we can see that more than 500 projects have been delayed, suspended or cancelled since March the 1st, that we know of and that we've validated. In terms of those, nearly 300 were in Saudi Arabia and more than 100 in the UAE and close to 50 in Kuwait, Oman and Qatar. Now, that might not necessarily be surprising because, of course, there are more projects in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, so you would expect that. In terms of the value of projects impacted, we've got more than $40 billion of projects suspended, delayed or cancelled in Saudi Arabia because since March the 1st, more than $15 billion in the UAE, and then more than $5 billion in Qatar, Kuwait and Oman. Now, if we take those same 500 plus projects which have been delayed, suspended or cancelled since March the 1st and compare them at their sectors with the number of active projects in each sector, we can see how each sector has been impacted. So with about 17 projects, petrochemical projects cancelled, delayed or suspended, that is approximately 4.5% of all active petrochemical projects in the MENA region. Likewise, for example, in power, and close to 50 projects put on hold, delayed or cancelled, that equates to 7.4% of all active power projects. So on a proportional basis, power has been much more affected than, say, oil, industrial or petrochemical projects, which all are less than 5% of their projects affected. The worst single sector, this is maybe quite surprising, is actually water. Close to 15% of all water projects, active water projects, has been suspended, delayed or cancelled in the MENA region. This is surprising because water is one of the few growth sectors in recent years. It's also a key priority for many governments. Likewise, we've seen close to 12% of transport projects, roads, airports, ports, and airports, etc., put on delayed, suspended or cancelled, and just 5% of construction projects. So, taking that data, we can then evaluate the risk or likelihood of projects being delayed or cancelled or suspended by their sector. And we can see here on this graph here, this bubble chart, and we can see the risk for each sector compared with the number of projects. So the higher the bubble, the more the projects there are. The further to the right is the higher the risk of those projects, and the size of the bubble equals the total value of the projects. So we can see that construction represents the largest value of projects as well as the largest number of projects, and is of medium risk in terms of sector, based on the data gathered since March the 1st and no projects cancelled or suspended. Whereas water represents a fairly small value of projects, a higher risk, and is one of the worst affected sectors. Then we see that transport, fairly large segment, second largest segment of all projects in terms of value and by number of projects, is also what we based on what we've seen so far, quite high risk. And again, this is all data taken from MEED projects using the analysis tools, exporting to Excel, and then pivoting the data. And it's just an illustration of the types of analysis that we can make using the system. In the next few webinars, I may well be splitting these sectors down into subsectors to look at elements of them, such as hospitals, schools, real estate, residential, commercial, etc., to get a more granular view. But you can do this using MEED projects data itself, going to Excel. Now, from just a qualitative perspective, what's happening in the market on a sector basis, just our viewpoints on the impacts on each individual sectors. So for petrochemicals, obviously we know there were fewer projects, but they tend to be larger in size. But the region does have an inherent advantage in lower cost feedstocks. We also know that they tend to be financed by banks on a project finance basis or by the private sector, and therefore are less likely to be hit by declines in government spending in the short-term basis. Of course, on a longer-term demand basis, global demand for petrochemicals, that might have an impact. Construction, we know, is the largest sector by pipeline in terms of value and number, yet we do know that it's also going to be hit hard by the current decline in residential demand and also for tourism and retail. So the short-term impact on construction is going to be quite heavy. There is some solace, though, in that we do expect social infrastructure like healthcare and education projects to be a priority when governments do prioritise their spending plans for this year and beyond. Industrial projects sector tends to be a fairly small sector like petrochemicals. Again, can be based on global demand. It can be based on also on low-cost feedstock and low-cost energy in the region, so better position maybe than other markets globally. And again, often are financed by the private sector and project finance, so different dynamics governing them. So for the time, in terms of the short-term impact, maybe less affected than others. Transport, obviously, are linked closely to global demand for things like tourism and retail, but also population growth. In the short term, airport projects, some railway projects are going to be impacted by the fact that often they're not priority for governments, and also for the fact that the demand scenarios are changing rapidly for them. So we might expect this sector to be quite hard hit in the short term. Oil and gas. So we did see a notable cancellation of a major oil and gas project by ADNOC just 3 weeks after it was signed in March. So the sector, as we've seen, has already been affected. And of course, we've also seen lower oil prices. That said, national oil companies do tend to spend today based on the requirements in 3 to 5 years' time when their projects come online. So they may not necessarily be looking at their projects from a short-term perspective, but nonetheless, there are going to be some cost constraints very evidently. When you're looking at the gas sector, we also have to understand that there is a long-term, very sharp need for gas for power self-sufficiency, and we expect that the gas sector will be prioritised perhaps over the oil sector. And then finally, in terms of power and water, well, governments have little choice when faced with surging power and water demand on the back of population growth, but to invest in power and water projects. So certainly we've seen some of the major renewable projects proceed at pace currently, even in light of COVID-19. We may see some of the more traditional fossil fuel projects, on the other hand, be delayed somewhat. On the desalination side, again, it's a function of demand. Governments have little choice but to invest in new power and water capacity. So looking forward, what are some of the opportunities for companies in this current market? So let's take a look at contracts currently in bid evaluation. As you can see here, we have more than $25 billion worth of projects which are bid evaluation, where bids have been submitted, and where normally we would expect them to be scheduled or due to be awarded over the next 3 or 4 months or so, between May and July. And you can see that split here. We've got Saudi Arabia, more than $10 billion. We have across different sectors. We likewise in UAE with close to $8 billion of contracts due to be awarded in the next 4 months. Oman, more than $3 billion. Egypt, also around $3 billion. Qatar, $2 billion. Iraq, $2 billion. Now, clearly, in this situation, not all of these projects are going to proceed. For example, we know that in Iraq, there's been a halt to all project spending. Likewise, in Oman, spending has dropped to almost zero. So it's clear that not all of this is going to materialize. Nonetheless, it is indicative of the intentions for each country originally, and can provide some indication of where the money is going to be spent. So even if we saw a 50% drop in project activity and spending in the next 4 months, we would expect Saudi Arabia and the UAE to be the two leading markets. On this side, again, data taken from MENA Projects. You can see those projects which are due to be, the top projects rather, which are due to be awarded over the next 4 months. Clearly, not all of them will take place. That said, if we go back to the previous slide and looking at the different sectors and the drivers for each sector, then we may expect some of these projects to proceed. For example, we know that renewable energy projects have been moving ahead quite swiftly. We might expect the second solar IPP in Abu Dhabi to proceed. We may also expect to see the wind farm in Egypt go ahead, the IWP, which is privately financed in Oman, also proceed. So depending on the sector and the situation in each country, it's possible to identify what projects might proceed and which ones might get delayed. And doing so, we are coming up at MENA Projects with a revised forecast for project spending in the GCC. Now, I haven't got, no one has a crystal ball, and of course things can change very rapidly, but based on the data today, based on the pipeline of projects due to be awarded, and based on what we know has happened in April and since the 1st of March, we have created a revised forecast for project spending overall in the GCC for 2020. So we had an original forecast in place before the COVID-19 situation became apparent. And at the beginning of the year, we actually forecast a considerable rise in overall project spending from just under $105 billion last year to $127 billion in 2020. Now, this forecast looked very promising at the time, but it was important to bear in mind that it was in part predicated on up to $20 billion of contract awards on the Qatar LNG program, which is obviously an exceptional one-off program and is not going to be repeated every year. If we did take that LNG program off, then actually we would be more or less fairly flat or up slightly on the 2019 numbers. So on that basis, we weren't going to see a very exceptional growth. Now, however, with the COVID situation upon us, we have created two additional scenarios. One is a scenario based on a 3-month lockdown or 3-month slowdown or very slow pace in project activity and economic activity as well, where we would see, based on the pipeline, a decline on the original forecast from $127 billion to just $107 billion. And that would include, again, the LNG program, which we do foresee as proceeding this year. If the situation was to remain like it is currently for up to 6 months, i.e. pretty much for the remainder of the year, then we would expect the slowdown to result in a revised forecast of just $87 billion for the year as a whole. Now, given that we've already seen more than $35 billion of contracts awarded, that means that we would only see some $45 billion awarded for the remainder of the year, including the Qatar LNG program. So that would be a considerable decline, not only on 2019 figures, but it would also represent the worst performance for the project market since at least 2002. That said, that's based on a 6-month outlook. If we're looking at the 3-month forecast, picture won't be as bad, pretty much flat year on year. And of course, that takes into account the Qatar LNG program. So how can companies in the projects market space, what can they do to mitigate some of the challenges currently facing them, and also what can they do in order to prosper and survive and build over the next few years? So here we've written down or noted down a number of key points we think companies should look at or consider in terms of the short term, the mid-term, and the long term. In the short term, we obviously would expect companies to consider the safety, legal, and financial implications of a slowdown, whether that's force majeure in contracts, whether that's the safety of their workers, and whether that's short-term issues around cash flow and payments, etc. Companies also are likely to be cutting their costs, obviously conserving cash and securing credit, as you would expect, in order to free up finance. I'm not going to go through every point here because I think we don't have the time to, and you can look at these in your own time. But these are just some of our expectations of what companies are doing and what we think may well be happening for companies in the project space. I would like to point out that it's obviously a good time for companies to adopt emerging emerging technologies in the project space. Things like 3D printing, digital twins, drone technology, robotics, etc., in order to prepare themselves and make them future-proof for changes and evolutions in the project market space. All right, so we saw in that revised forecast for 2020 between 107 and $87 billion of contracts awarded this year. However, for on a pipeline basis for a longer term, what's the picture? So the good news is that despite all the upheaval in a temporary basis that we've seen right now, in the long term, over the next 5-10 years, we still have a very positive pipeline of project opportunities in the MENA region. In fact, we've got well over $3 trillion of future known projects. Clearly, the largest market, as we can see here with data taken from MEED projects, is Saudi Arabia, more than $1.2 trillion, close to $800 billion of projects in the pipeline in the UAE. Then Egypt, close to $400 billion. Iraq, which obviously has huge requirements for infrastructure and housing, as well as oil and gas, more than $350 billion. Then Kuwait, $200 billion, and so on. So we still have a very, very significant pipeline of projects. And hey, even if only 50% of those projects ever come about, that's still $1.5 trillion, and that's still a very significant pipeline of opportunity for companies to take advantage of. And of course, as ever, you can go onto MEED projects to see what those individual projects are. Right, in terms of the top future clients going forward, well, as you might expect, this is a list dominated by government entities or government-related entities, led by the nuclear energy program in Saudi Arabia, the King Abdullah City of Atomic Renewable Energy, KCARE, within a DAEP in Dubai for the Al Maktoum International Airport, Rosatom for the nuclear project in Egypt, Qatar Gas obviously is part of the LNG program in Qatar, NIOC in Iran, and so on. I won't go through the entire list, but as you can see, there's a very diverse list of key future clients. And this list will change over time, depending on what sectors of the economy get prioritization by the governments in light of once this situation is over. Now let's look at before we look at the questions, go to questions and answers, and I would urge you all to submit your questions to answer them today, and if not today, we will come back to you and answer them in due course. Let's just look at some of the key projects which contribute to the numbers that we've just seen in this presentation, because I think it's important just to not just look at the numbers, but also to look at what's actually that they mean in terms of projects on the ground. And I thought today would be a good chance to look at perhaps 4 or 5 of the most interesting opportunities emerging in Saudi Arabia in terms of the Saudi Public Investment Fund projects as part of Saudi 2030 vision. One of them, and perhaps the most advanced, is the Red Sea project, led by the Red Sea Development Company. As so many of you will know, this is a very large multi-billion-dollar project off the Red Sea coast to develop the tourism industry in the kingdom, and involves the development of several islands, more than 90 islands in fact, with hotels, resorts, and of course associated utilities, road access, and so on. So this is well underway right now, and many more packages to come, starting with an award we expect soon on the airport to serve the development, and this is indeed a very exciting project and well underway. If you want more details, you can of course go onto MEED Projects to search for the individual projects, the contacts and bidders and consultants, etc. for them. Likewise, you can also use MEED Projects to find out about the Diriyah Gate project. This is a really fascinating multi-billion-dollar project just on the western outskirts of Riyadh. It's the birthplace of the Al Saud dynasty. It's a cultural UNESCO heritage site, and the intention is to sensitively develop the area with commercial and retail facilities, build a lot of underground roads and utilities because of the cultural aspect of the project, as well as alongside that build a very exclusive golfing and residential hub, called Wadi Safar. So you get some of the ideas of some of the packages currently underway there. And again, if you want more details, you can go on to MEED Projects for the individual scopes on each package. Also part of the Saudi 2030 vision and the desire to develop a tourism industry is the Al Ula project in central northwestern Saudi Arabia. As you can see here, this is a site that is looks very similar to the well-known Petra UNESCO heritage site in Jordan. This is a relatively undeveloped part of Saudi Arabia, and the authorities want to attract tourism and develop a new tourism hub there. Again, this is well underway. It's going to feature several high-end hotel resorts, as well as a retail and commercial hub there. It's going to require an airport, of course, access roads and utilities, and is again another very significant project, multi-billion-dollar project planned in the kingdom. And last but not least, we have another equally exciting multi-billion-dollar project, which is called Qiddiya. It's about 40 minutes outside of Riyadh, and is basically aimed at creating a world-class, world-scale leisure and tourism destination to serve the capital's population. It's covering a huge area. It's being implemented on a fast-track basis. It's going to be a really exciting project with lots of interesting elements to it: retail, commercial, and of course leisure. And it's built in an untouched area of the kingdom, and is underway as we speak. And again, for more details, you can go on to MEED Projects to learn more about how to take advantage of those. So finally, just to remind everyone, in terms of the data today, it's been taken from MEED Projects. You can find out about all the individual project opportunities on the projects tracking service. We do have a special Ramadan offer for any of those of you who are interested, and you can just click on this link in order to find out more. And of course, alongside MEED Projects, we have our sister product, MEED.com, which is full of features, analysis, and news to provide context for the project's development in the region. And on both sites, you can find a huge amount of COVID-19 briefings and contents, other webinars and videos, and so on, to keep you fully up to date with what's happening. And then very finally, before I answer the questions, we also have a report out at the moment. It's the MENA Projects Outlook, updated with the latest data on the coronavirus and its impact on the market, revised forecasts, and so on. And if those of you who are interested in that, you can go onto our online store to purchase it, or of course speak to your account manager or visit our websites to find out more. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this presentation, and I'll now start taking your questions. I can see we have close to 50 questions waiting, and we'll attempt to answer some of them. I doubt I'll be able to answer all of them in the 15-20 minutes or so remaining. However, we have noted down the questions, and we will come back to you with them in due course. Alternatively, you can contact us either at edward.james@meed.com, myself, or you can contact our customer care team at customercare@meed.com. And just a reminder that this presentation is being recorded and will be made available to you in video format, so you can look at it again in your own time. Okay, so now I'm going to answer your questions. Thank you very much for them. Keep them coming. Even if I don't answer all of them today, we will come back to you. We'll note them down and come back to you and help you with them. So I guess we'll start off with quite a kind of general but a very pertinent question. What is going to be the new normal in the MENA, taking into account the oil price fall and COVID-19? And I'm glad that the question mentioned the oil price fall, because while the COVID-19 situation will inevitably be resolved sooner or later, hopefully sooner, it may well be that it's the fall in the oil prices that in the long term may be the most problematic issue for countries and economies in the region. Clearly, governments are going to have to adjust to a new reality, to lower revenues in the face of lower oil prices if they don't return to normal, to $50, $60 a barrel. And that is, of course, going to affect project spending overall, given that most projects are funded by the state. The state in itself is funded most frequently in the region by oil sales. So the new normal will probably, like we saw after 2015, will be probably a general average fall in the value of contracts awarded each year, at least in the short term. Longer term, what I would expect is for governments to develop new strategies and ways of implementing their project program, because the projects are still needed. There's no escaping the fact that we need more housing, that we need more power and water facilities in the region, more social infrastructure. It's how we're going to finance these projects, which is likely to be the changes that we're going to see. We're going to see most likely more PPP type projects, more participation of the private sector, more government borrowing to finance projects, and more innovative ways of financing them. I think we may well see now far fewer directly government financed projects, and we're going to see, I hope, a greater contribution by the private sector. But I think the new normal is going to be perhaps in the short term at least, lower average contract awards each year, and in the longer run, I would hope that would rise to where we've been in the last few years, but also perhaps see more PPP type projects and more private sector participation. I got a quick question about India and China, why they're the only global economies set to grow. Well, they're the only major global economies set to grow, and that's really because they're still emerging markets, developing markets, and have very fast growing populations and very catching up economies. And really, I guess it reflects the fact that they're coming from a lower base than some of the more mature advanced economies elsewhere. So that's really the prime reason. But we've seen China and India grow at 6 to 10% each year economically. Even with the revised forecast by the IMF, we are expecting to see this fall to just 1 to 3%. So we are seeing in the short term, even those countries have a major slowdown in project activity. A question about a specific project in Oman. That's the Duqm refinery project. Do you expect it to stop? I don't, and of course I haven't got a crystal ball or perhaps an inside track on that particular project. This is the $5 billion refinery project in Oman, in Duqm, the project is project finance. The finance is already allocated. It's predicated on a commercial basis on being able to store and refine crude and to export it around the world. So that commercial rationale for 2-3 years time when it's commissioned, it's more or less still there. The finance is secure, so I don't expect that project to stop. And I think it's those kind of questions you need to be asking about individual projects to determine whether or not you think they will proceed. Question about Iraq and why it's enforcing force majeure. Is it politics, is it perspectives, or other perspectives, who gains from it? Well, I think Iraq, of all countries, is perhaps one of the most dependent on oil and gas revenues, and they've seen oil revenues dramatically fall in the last few months, to the extent that they're actually in a situation where they can't afford to pay for the projects. And simple as that, really. They can, at this rate, will run out of finances to finance their own staff, their own employees, those employed by the state, by July at the current rate. So it makes natural sense, common sense for the Iraqis that they're going to have to put some of these projects on hold until the oil price recovers. And that's really a reason for the force majeure. Force majeure gives them a way out from, or gives them a reason to suspend projects and suspend payments to contractors. So yeah, I guess the Iraqis had little choice but to go down this route. Obviously, we would hope that this force majeure clauses are not implemented on a widespread basis across the region as a whole. A question about Saudi Arabia, and I think you can really ask this about all countries. Will the government reduce the budget and continue with the projects in the same scale, or will they scale down the projects and delay them? And I think this question is pertinent for all markets in the MENA region. It's clear that the governments are going to cut back on their budgets. The oil price has fallen, revenues from VAT and retail and tourism, etc., have fallen and collapsed as well. There's going to be massive stimuluses injected, and it's going to cost the governments money. And spending is going to be cut. There's no doubt about it. And of course, some projects are going to be delayed or cancelled as a result. Now, we may well see some projects scaled down. We may see some projects merged or reconfigured or redesigned to cope with the new, adjust to the new reality. We just have to wait and see. It's very difficult at this stage to know what's going to happen. The governments themselves haven't released a priority list of projects. They haven't necessarily said what they will focus on and what they won't focus on. But projects are going to be affected, and I think that's reflected in our revised forecasts for 2020 and the year ahead. Do you have an update on big oil and gas projects like Marjan, Berri, Safaniya, etc.? Well, a lot of the big oil and gas projects mentioned there are already underway, under construction. So Aramco is obviously a major player. It has embarked on these projects based on a need for them in 3-4 years' time, and I would expect them to continue. Where there is greater uncertainty, I think, is on those projects yet to be awarded. Projects as we saw, like the Dalma field was awarded and 3 weeks later cancelled, and then of course and then of course that goes the same. That's the same for other Aramco projects in bidding right now. I think we might well see delays to them. And some uncertainty about them. We might see NOCs push contractors on costs. We may see some value engineering done on them, some reconfigurations, maybe some reductions in scope. But I think by and large, as we saw earlier, the oil and gas sector, I think will emerge from this fairly unscathed. I think and we will see a lot of these projects proceed, albeit maybe at a slower pace, albeit with some delays. But I think the oil and gas industry, projects industry in the region will emerge, will survive this period, and won't see too many cancellations or project postponements. In Kuwait, will the new airport be postponed or cancelled, or will we see a compromise on specifications to save on spending? Well, in Kuwait, as many of you will know, Limak, the Turkish contractor, was awarded a $4 billion project about 4 years ago to build the new airport, and that is called new terminal for the existing airport, and that is currently underway. It's quite an advanced stage now, so we'll see what happens on that project. Is it quite an advanced specifications on that project? Is going for gold LEED basis. It has been designed by Foster and Partners. So we might well see some late changes to the specs for that project, but we'll just have to wait and see. Again, we just have to wait and see on a lot of projects on what's going to happen. How do you see ExxonMobil, West Qurna, and CNOOC Misan oil expansions in Iraq going? I think Iraq oil and gas projects are interesting. While certainly we've seen force majeure by the government on public sector contracts, clearly we've got a slightly different issue when the fields are operated by international oil companies like West Qurna, like Misan. Certainly at Misan, we've seen CNOOC continue to release tenders. In fact, there was a tender just issued, a major tender issued just this week. And I would say that depending on the IOC and depending on their strategy, some projects will get delayed, but others will continue at pace. And I expect that fields run by Chinese operators will be on that latter, fall under that latter situation where they will continue. On the other hand, some of the Western IOCs, due to the situations they're facing, globally, the oil price and the downturn for their revenues, we might see them try to save on costs by suspending some of their projects in Iraq too. Right, how would we do? How could we do a webinar without a question about Dubai real estate? And of course, as we know, we've seen the Dubai Expo now moved from October this year to October 2021. Is that the final nail in the coffin for the real estate sector in Dubai? Well, I think we've already seen a slow decline in real estate in Dubai in any case over the last 3 or 4 years. We've seen real estate property prices fall quite dramatically. We've seen demand fall as well. And even without this pandemic, I would have expected that to continue this year, especially with the committee set up to try and control demand of new projects, supply of new projects into the market. I actually think that moving the Expo to next year may well turn out to be an unexpectedly good thing for the real estate sector. I think it's going to come at a time when the real estate sector may have moved to a better demand situation, where demand might be growing, prices might even be rising, and I think it might come just at the right time to provide some stimulus for the market. That said, clearly we are not going to see a huge number of new real estate schemes in Dubai, or in the UAE indeed, this year. We might see some, and we've seen some, but we're not going to see a large number of launches this year. And it's going to be a difficult 12 months, certainly for the sector. But I believe it could emerge from this current situation quite nicely in time for the Expo at the end of next year. So it actually, by chance, have actually been a good thing for the Expo to move to end of next year. So a question about the contracts being delayed or suspended. So we have approximately 500 to 600 projects that we know about today, either in execution or pre-execution, cancelled, suspended or delayed since the 1st of March that we know of. Now, at the moment, in the MENA region, we're currently tracking about 12,000 active projects. So that 500, 600 is obviously a fairly small proportion of that overall 12,000 active projects. Of course, at the same time, this is only, that 500, 600 number is only of the projects that we've been able to confirm just the last few weeks, and that number will surely rise over time. So clearly, if it reaches 1,000, then we'd be looking at between 8 and 10% of all projects being suspended or delayed because of COVID-19. But we'll have to wait and see at the end, later, to see what the final impact is going to be. Quick question about how I define the construction sector. A construction sector in MEED projects terminology is civil construction of buildings such as towers, villas, hospitals, hotels, theme parks, and so forth. It's not related to EPC projects in the oil and gas and power space. Do we expect to see a surge in chemical projects over time due to lower feedstock prices? Actually, the trend in the last few years is for feedstock prices to rise as government subsidies are lowered. Actually, that makes the case for chemical projects weaker in the Middle East. And even with better feedstock prices, we've seen SABIC make a big loss in the last 3 months. So I don't expect to see a surge in petrochemical projects. What I do expect to see more of is acceleration of this trend of integrating refineries with petrochemical projects in order to create a value chain in country in order to add value to the petrochemical industry. Okay, just going through the questions. Another question about what the definition of construction is. I hope I've already clarified that. Civil construction of buildings. Active projects. What is the definition of active projects? Active projects are projects which are either in construction or in pre-bid stage, i.e. study or design or tender issue stage. So active projects are any project which has not been complete on or cancelled. How do we see construction spending in Abu Dhabi going forward, specifically the projects that are ongoing? Now, I haven't spoken much about Abu Dhabi today and in the presentation, and that's because there hasn't been a huge amount of announcements made by the authorities in Abu Dhabi with regards to project spending overall. We've seen ADNOC ask for cutting in costs from its contractors and suppliers, but in terms of the Abu Dhabi government and authorities there, we haven't seen any wider specific announcements about cuts. Abu Dhabi is obviously financially much sounder than many other countries in the region. It has a large oil and gas sector. It has a lot of large fiscal reserves, and we'll just have to wait and see how it wants to proceed. There was an announcement in part about the need to accelerate project spending, and what I think we will see is the government make big strides to ensure that any pending payments to contractors are made in order to keep the cash flow situation positive for many companies. Whether or not we'll see a lot of new projects as a result of this, I'm not so sure. I don't believe we will. But I think the emphasis right now in Abu Dhabi, a lot of it is on power and water projects, and I do believe that we won't see a delay to them, especially as a lot of them are going to be privately financed. Okay, I'm just going, obviously I've got a lot of questions. I'm going to try and keep questions quite diversified on different sectors and countries to ensure that I'm answering all aspects. I got a question here about, you said projects are affected, but we don't see any comment in MEED project database flagging which projects are delayed or shelved. It would be helpful to know. I completely agree, and we certainly are considering adding a new field on a short-term basis to identify for our customers which projects have been impacted by COVID-19. At the moment, we do this analysis by through the news by understanding whether a project has been delayed or not, and also, of course, by a change of status from execution or pre-execution to on hold or cancelled. Do you spread, I believe TIC, I believe you mean contract awards over the project duration, or is it an absolute number at the time of the award? So when we're looking at these figures, we're generally looking at the value of the contract at the time of award rather than spread over time. MEED Projects does have a cash flow model and a cash spent figure and field for every project. So it is possible on the site to do a cash flow analysis rather than a one-off contract award analysis. We use contract award at a single point in time simply for ease of indicating how the market is performing, particularly over time. A question generally about digital technologies and introducing new technologies into companies. I think we are getting a trend now, and this is going to be accelerated by the need to cut costs and be as efficient as possible for companies to increasingly use these emerging technologies on their projects, whether it's digital twins, whether it's drones for technology, robotics, whether it's Internet of Things or big data. These are becoming more and more commonplace in companies. And certainly if you look at contractors, there is a lot of attention being paid to these now. And you know, in response to government initiatives and in response to government desires to make things more efficient and to introduce more of these evolving technologies into projects. And I think, you know, just as we've seen BIM become more and more commonplace, I do expect over the next year to 5 to 10 years, a lot of these technologies become commonplace and become requirements on projects. So I think companies which adopt these technologies are going to be the ones which are going to be able to perform the best over the next few years. Question about renewable energy projects and oil prices, and do oil prices today have an effect on renewable energy projects? Well, I think we're now at a point where renewable energy, particularly solar energy, is now becoming so cost efficient at a cost comparable to gas-fired projects that really the case for widespread adoption of world-scale solar and wind projects in the region has been made, and I would expect them to become the norm alongside baseload nuclear or fossil fuel or thermal power projects going forward. And I think if you look at the REPDO plans in Saudi Arabia, if you look at the DOE projects in Abu Dhabi and DEWA projects in Dubai, just as an example, I think we're well past the point now of these projects being tentative or being pilot projects. We are now going to see an increasing focus on renewable energy, and if you look at the targets set by each country, then that's also equally apparent. So regardless of the oil price, up or down, I think we're now in a scenario where solar and wind power projects are here to stay, particularly at the prices that are being bid for, which are being submitted. NEOM, a question about NEOM. Now, NEOM is a $500 billion new city project, for those of you who don't know, in the far northwest of the kingdom. It is by far and away the largest single project in the MENA Projects database and plan in the region. Now, it's also, perhaps of all the PIF projects, probably the most laggardly in terms of development. Maybe not a surprise given the sheer scale of the project. And also at the same time, that might make it most at risk of prioritization or adjusting of the design and feasibility of the project. When we're looking at these PIF projects, you do have to look at Qiddiya and the Red Sea project as perhaps being the most advanced and therefore the most likely to proceed, and then projects like Amala and NEOM being kind of more struggling at this moment because of their the sort of the lateness in progress compared with the other projects. So it's very difficult at this moment to see an immediate big input of investment in NEOM, given the current situation. But again, it is also a key component of the 2030 vision and of the political political vision as well for the kingdom. So we'll have to wait and see on that. But I wouldn't be surprised to see some rescaling or scaling down of that project. A question here about margins. The question goes, we already have very tight margins in the construction industry, and how realistic is it to expect any further cost cutting on current or future projects? Well, as many of you who are contractors will know, some contractors, it isn't really feasible to cut projects costs anymore, and indeed companies simply won't be able to, and clients have also got to be realistic in their expectations. In this kind of situation, what we have seen is the emergence of even lower cost contractors and subcontractors come into the market, and due to their lower costs are able to bid at much lower margins or even cost. And so we've seen a slight displacement of many contractors by some of these emerging contracting outfits, and therefore that is one of the results, unfortunately, of falling margins. For many companies, it's a case really of working with clients who understand the situation, understand that lower margins equals often lower quality, and therefore understand that contractors need to make money, they need to keep in business and work in partnership. So sometimes it's about finding the right projects, finding the right clients, but in reality, there's not much lower that construction costs can go, and either projects are reconfigured to reflect that and value engineered, or the projects just won't be able to proceed with the contractors' envisaged budgets. Let me just go through some more questions. I'm just aware of time. Okay, I'm already running over, so perhaps just one or two more questions. Thank you very much for your patience. If we haven't answered your question today, do not worry. We have noted down to it. We have noted who sent it and the question itself, and we will come back to you with an answer for that. So let me just go through some of the last questions. I'm trying to make sure that we're answering all of them. What is the status of oil and gas EPCs like McDermott, Saipem, Petrofac, and TR? Well, we've seen the impact already on a company like Petrofac. Petrofac clearly had won the $1.5 billion plus of projects in the Dalma field for ADNOC, and then just 3 weeks later had to announce that the projects had been cancelled. And you know, globally, you're going to see a big slowdown in new oil and gas projects in the US, for example, maybe in Russia and other areas. And so we're probably going to see an increased focus by these companies on the MENA region. I've already seen this happen to a certain extent over the last few years, and I think there's going to be even greater competition amongst these contractors for an ever smaller pool of work. So they're going to have to make cost cuts like any other business. We've already seen some of these companies announce retrenchment of workers. They're going to have to look at their cost bases, and they're going to have to also reflect the need by their NOCs for lower costs. So they're going to have to be imaginative. They're going to have to look at ways in which they can also cut the costs on current projects as well as projects which they're going to bid on. Can we have a similar seminar in key projects in oil and gas chemicals, particularly in GCC countries? Yes, that's a very good point. If you have any particular topic you would like to address in future webinars, just please enter it, not as necessary as a question, but you can enter it here on this Q&A sheet, and we will take that into account when preparing future presentations. Whom to contact for a copy of the presentation? You don't need to contact anyone. We have your details when you registered. We will get in touch with you with the details of how to download it and access it. Also, as someone mentioned here, the invitation to this webinar mentioned that attendees will receive a complimentary report. Yes, that complimentary report will consist of some of the data and slides that you've seen today, as well as some other data from MEED Projects and MEED. And so we will get in touch with you again with that to send that to you. Okay, I'm going to ask just one more question, actually, because we're now quite a bit over time. Thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry if I haven't answered all of your questions. I'll make this the last one, and that is, how do you think the PPP or BOT projects will proceed? And I think the answer to that question I may have touched on already in this presentation. I think actually we will see a greater emphasis in acceleration of PPP projects, as well as BOT projects or project finance projects, because these are projects which won't be dependent on government spending. The private sector will be more involved and be responsible for financing the projects, and I think that takes a lot of stress away from them. And I believe we will see a greater number of projects implemented on a PPP basis going forward, given the tightness of government finances. That said, for PPP to succeed in the region, there has to be major changes to regulations and laws to make PPP projects more attractive to the private sector, and also to better allocate risk. PPP outside of oil and gas and airports in the region has had a fairly mixed record, to the extent that there were very, very few PPP projects outside of power and water and airports. So yes, we will see more PPP projects. For them to be successful, we will need to see changes in attitude from clients to ensure that the risk is fairly allocated and the laws and regulations changed or updated to reflect that. Okay, there are so many more questions. Unfortunately, I just do not have the time to be able to answer them. Thank you so much for them, though, and thank you so much for coming in today and listening to this webinar. I really hope you found it informative and useful. As I said, we will be sending this to you in due course. We've got your names and your email addresses, so we will contact you with those reports and data and send them to you in due course. And of course, please get in touch with us. My email address is here, edward.james@mee.com, or contact us at customercare@mee.com. Just one final plug, if I may. We do have a special offer for MEED projects at the moment. If you are interested in tracking projects, individual project opportunities in the region, we do have a special Ramadan offer. Get in touch with us, please, we think that the service is going to be extremely useful to understand what's happening in the market, and also at an individual project level, understand what the individual project opportunities are and how you can gain access to them and win work. Also, similarly, mee.com, please visit mee.com. That is a exceptional news analysis and features website. There's a monthly review magazine that comes out as well. It is the ultimate resource for project news and context in the region. And also, please check out our reports. And if you want to know what's going on in more depth, you can access our MENA Projects report. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. I look forward to getting your feedback and answering your questions. And that leaves me all to say, see you next week for our next webinar, next Wednesday. And I wish you all the very best and hope that you can all stay safe and prosper in these difficult times. Thank you very much. Goodbye.